close your eyes and drift back in time to an age where dinner might be a chunk of stale bread, a suspicious stew, and maybe, if you were lucky, a piece of meat that didn't smell too rotten. Welcome to the medieval table, where flavor was optional, hygiene was a myth, and culinary creativity was, well, questionable. Tonight, we'll softly guide you through the strange and unappetizing world of medieval food, boring enough to lull you to sleep, but fascinating enough to haunt your next meal. In the heart of a medieval home, the kitchen wasn't a cozy place of warmth and delightful smells. It was often a smoky, chaotic chamber where the line between cooking and surviving blurred. The idea of a kitchen as we know it today barely existed. There were no countertops, no proper ventilation, and certainly no appliances. Instead, imagine a large, open hearth in the middle of the room, or along one wall, its fire crackling endlessly, serving as the central hub for heat, light, and cooking. The smoke from this fire would billow through the air, stinging the eyes and clinging to clothing, hair, and every surface. Chimneys were rare until later centuries, so the smoke had to find its own way out, if it did at all. Everything was cooked over this open flame. Stews hung in iron pots suspended by chains, bubbling for hours or even days. Meat, if it could be found, was roasted on spits or skewered and held close to the embers. Bread was baked in clay ovens that retained heat from the fire or simply cooked on hot stones. It was a slow, imperfect process that required constant attention. There were no timers, no temperature controls, just instinct, experience, and guesswork. Sometimes the bread burned, sometimes it was undercooked. But as long as it was edible and didn't make anyone sick, it was good enough. Storage in the kitchen was equally primitive. There were no refrigerators, of course, and ice was a rare luxury reserved for the very wealthy. Most perishable items had to be eaten quickly, salted to death, dried in the sun, or smoked over those same fires that made the air nearly unbreathable. Meat was hung from the ceiling beams, not just to keep it cool, but to protect it from rats, cats, dogs, and anything else that might sneak in looking for a bite. Cheese and butter were precious, labor-intensive commodities stored in cool cellars when available, and often subject to the whims of temperature and time. Hygiene was barely a concept. Animals roamed freely in and out of homes, especially in rural areas. Chickens scratched at the dirt floors. Dogs waited underfoot for scraps. Pigs might be kept nearby, or even inside, during colder months. There were no sinks, no running water, only wooden buckets, basins, and whatever water could be fetched from the nearest well or stream. And that water wasn't always clean. Utensils, when they existed, were used communally. A single knife might be shared by an entire family. Spoons were carved from wood or bone. Forks were rare and seen as decadent or even suspicious, associated more with foreign customs than practical eating. Despite the conditions, the medieval kitchen was the heart of the home. It was where warmth could be found in winter, where stories were shared, and where meals, however modest, were created with what little people had. But it was not a place of peace. It was hot in summer, freezing in winter, and dangerous year-round. Burns, cuts, and infections were common. Fire was a constant threat. A stray spark or unattended flame could easily reduce an entire home to ashes. There were no fire departments to call, no safety regulations, just risk every single day. Yet people made it work, day after day. With limited tools and meager ingredients, meals were prepared and shared. It might not have been delicious, it was rarely clean. But in its own way, the medieval kitchen kept families alive through centuries of hardship, hunger, and hope. Bread was the backbone of the medieval diet. In fact, for many people, especially peasants, it was the entire meal. But forget the soft, warm, fluffy loaves you might picture from a modern bakery. Medieval bread was a different beast altogether. Dense, rough, gritty, and at times barely edible. There were different kinds of bread for different classes of people, and the type of bread you ate said a lot about your place in society. For the wealthy, bread was made from finely sifted white flour, what was called manchet bread. It was soft, light in color, and closer to the kind of bread we know today. But this refinement took extra time and effort. The bran and husks were removed through multiple siftings, meaning that the more refined the bread, the more expensive and labor-intensive it was. Only the upper class could afford this level of luxury in their daily bread. The rest of the population, the vast majority, ate what was known as brown bread or rye bread, made from coarsely ground grains. These loaves were darker, tougher, and far less appealing. In fact, the bread often contained particles of dirt or bits of ground-up millstone from poorly maintained grinders. This wasn't just unpleasant, it could actually wear down people's teeth over time, leading to chronic dental problems. Some archaeological studies have found that medieval skeletons often had worn, flattened teeth from years of chewing this abrasive bread. Worse still, in times of scarcity, people mixed in whatever they could to make flour stretch further. Sometimes that meant acorns, peas, or beans. Other times it meant things that weren't meant to be eaten at all. Bark, sawdust, old flour that had gone rancid or moldy. Food safety wasn't a concept. If it looked like flour, it was used. And if the bread made you sick, well, you'd probably just try something different next time. There was also a curious and slightly off-putting use of bread in place of plates. These were called trenchers, thick, stale slices of bread that functioned as edible dishware. Food would be piled on top of the trencher, and once the meal was done, it could be eaten. But more often, especially in wealthy households, the trencher was so soaked with juices, grease, and sauces that it was tossed to the dogs or given to the poor. Either way, bread had many lives in the medieval world. It was a tool, a necessity, a symbol of class, and often the only thing standing between survival and starvation. Sometimes bread was sour, not by design, but because the natural yeast from the air fermented the dough in unpredictable ways. This is how sourdough was born, not as a trendy artisan choice, but as a byproduct of primitive baking. There was no commercial yeast, no baking powder, no exact measurements, just flour, water, salt if you had it, and time. Lots of time. Bread could take hours to prepare and bake, often in shared ovens owned by the lord of the manor, or by the community itself. In some places, villagers had to pay a fee just to use the lord's oven, a fee that could eat into their already small share of food. Bread was never just bread. It was a marker of class, a risk to your health, a product of hard labor, and sometimes even an offering of religious significance. It could feed your family, or remind you how little you had. But no matter how it looked, tasted, or felt in your hands, bread was always there, day after day, year after year, a constant companion in a world of unpredictable hunger. In the medieval world, vegetables were not cherished as they are today. In fact, they were often treated more like filler than food, something to bulk up a stew or keep your stomach from growling, but not something to savor. If you were a peasant, vegetables were what you ate because you had no choice. And if you were wealthy, vegetables were something you looked down on. Poor people's food, pulled from the dirt and lacking the prestige of meat or fine grains. The medieval understanding of nutrition was deeply influenced by ancient Greek medical theories, especially the idea of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These had to be kept in balance, and foods were thought to affect this balance through qualities like hot, cold, dry, and moist. Many vegetables were considered cold and moist, which, according to prevailing medical theory, made them dangerous if not prepared correctly. Eating raw vegetables, for example, was seen as risky, believed to cause bloating, imbalance, or even illness. So, salad was rarely on the menu. When vegetables were eaten, they were boiled into mush, stewed for hours, or cooked until all texture and flavor were long gone. Safety over taste, always. Root vegetables were common because they could be stored longer and grown easily in poor soil. Turnips, parsnips, onions, garlic, and leeks were kitchen staples for the common folk. Cabbage was everywhere, though it was often boiled beyond recognition. Carrots existed, but they weren't the bright orange carrots we know today. They were usually purple, yellow, or white, and a bit woodier in texture. Beans and peas were crucial sources of protein for the lower classes. Lentils were also eaten, though they had a reputation for being windy, a polite way of saying they caused digestive issues. Interestingly, tomatoes and potatoes, two vegetables that are now diet staples, were entirely absent from medieval Europe. They hadn't yet been introduced from the Americas, so people lived and died without ever tasting fries or tomato sauce. Instead, they relied heavily on native and seasonal produce, often dried or pickled for use during the long winter months. Fermentation was not just a culinary choice, it was a necessity. For seasoning, herbs were sometimes used, but mostly by those who could afford gardens or had access to nearby woodlands. Parsley, sage, dill, and mustard seeds were known, though not in the quantities or combinations we're used to. Spices, which could have improved the flavor of bland vegetables, were too expensive for daily use by the lower class. So most meals tasted earthy, and not in the trendy farm-to-table way, more like muddy, soggy, and occasionally bitter. One peculiar aspect of medieval cooking was how vegetables were lumped together into a vague category called pottage. This was a thick, vegetable-based stew that could include grains, onions, leeks, and whatever else was lying around. Pottage was served nearly every day in peasant homes. It was endlessly variable but rarely exciting. Sometimes it was eaten with bread. Other times it was poured over a trencher or eaten straight from a shared pot. And since refrigeration didn't exist, yesterday's pottage often became today's, with new ingredients just added in and reheated. It wasn't about taste, it was about survival. The disdain for vegetables wasn't just culinary, it had social implications. The more vegetables you ate, the poorer you were perceived to be. Nobles and clergy preferred meat, cheese, and bread. A plate full of vegetables meant you couldn't afford the good stuff. So vegetables became symbolic of poverty, not health. Ironically, the peasant diet, while boring, was often more nutritious than the meat-heavy diet of the elite. But no one in medieval Europe was counting vitamins or fiber. Food was about status, survival, and keeping your humours in check. Fish was not just food in medieval times. It was practically a religion, quite literally, in fact. The Catholic Church mandated dozens of fast days throughout the year: Fridays, Lent, Advent, and various saints' days, when eating meat was forbidden. But fish didn't count as meat. So it became the go-to alternative, consumed by peasants and nobles alike, whether they liked it or not. And many probably didn't like it, not because fish was inherently bad, but because medieval methods of preserving and preparing it left a lot to be desired. The problem was freshness. Unless you lived near the coast or next to a river, fresh fish was rare. Transportation was slow and there was no refrigeration. So by the time fish reached your village, it was often dried, salted, pickled, or smoked beyond recognition. Imagine chewing on something that resembled leathery sea jerky, soaked in brine and aged in barrels. That was dinner, Salted herring was one of the most common fish on the medieval table, especially in Northern Europe. It was cheap, abundant, and easily preserved, which also meant it was eaten a lot, maybe too much. Entire fleets were dedicated to catching and salting herring, and barrels of the stuff were traded like gold. But even if it was valuable, it wasn't always appetizing. Soaking it to remove the salt took time, and even then it could still taste like a wet boot dipped in seawater. Eels were another staple. Slimy, wriggling creatures pulled from rivers and swamps. They were considered a delicacy by some, though to others they were more of a last resort. Rich or poor, many people ate them, and because they were technically fish, they were allowed on fast days. But cleaning, skinning, and cooking eels was no simple task. It was a slippery, unpleasant job. Still, they were nutritious and relatively easy to catch, which made them a reliable, if unappealing, food source. In monastic communities, fish farming became a solution. Monks created artificial ponds where they bred carp and other freshwater species. These fish were considered more respectable and were sometimes raised specifically for religious feasts. But even then, unless the fish was cooked and eaten immediately, it had to be preserved somehow. Smoking and salting were the go-to methods. Spices, when available, helped mask the worst of the flavor, but not everyone could afford that luxury. Most people simply got used to the taste, or learned to suppress their gag reflex. Shellfish was consumed in coastal areas, but was not highly prized. Oysters, mussels, and clams were seen as food for the poor or desperate. They were abundant, which made them suspicious. In a world where rarity equaled value, the ease of collecting shellfish lowered their status. It wasn't until much later in history that oysters would become a delicacy. The smell of fish often lingered everywhere, in the markets, the kitchens, even on the people themselves. And without proper waste disposal, fish scraps and guts were thrown into streets, streams, or cesspits, contributing to the foul stench of medieval towns. Combined with other unwashed realities of the time, it created an atmosphere that few today could tolerate for more than a few minutes. Despite all this, fish was vital. It filled bellies when meat was forbidden. It provided protein to people who couldn't afford livestock. It was central to the rhythms of religious life, embedded into the spiritual and physical calendar. People didn't eat fish because they loved it. They ate it because they had to. It was survival disguised as ritual, obligation served as supper. Meat in the medieval world was the ultimate status symbol. If you had it regularly, you were probably wealthy, powerful, or tied to the church. If you didn't, well, welcome to the vast majority. For peasants, meat was a rare treat, reserved for special occasions, religious festivals, or whatever scraps they could trap, poach, or scavenge. But even for the nobility, meat was not always the succulent, juicy centerpiece we might imagine today. Without refrigeration or modern hygiene, meat often came with a side of risk and a heavy dose of spice to cover up the smell of decay. In rural villages, peasants might occasionally eat pork from pigs they raised themselves. Pigs were ideal livestock for the poor. They could eat just about anything, were relatively easy to breed, and could be slaughtered and preserved to last through the winter. But this was a once-a-year event for most families. The meat would be salted, smoked, or turned into sausages and bacon, staples that could be stretched out for months. The parts we now discard, feet, snouts, organs, were eaten too. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be wasted. Chickens and eggs were valuable, but again, they were often kept for their ongoing production rather than as immediate food. Killing a chicken meant you lost a future source of eggs, so poultry was eaten sparingly, usually when the bird had stopped laying or was too old to be useful. Cows were even less commonly slaughtered among the poor. They were beasts of burden and a source of milk. Killing a cow was like burning down your barn to stay warm for one night. Game meat, deer, rabbits, boar, was highly prized, but hunting was restricted. Forests were controlled by the nobility, and poaching could result in brutal punishment. Still, some peasants risked it. A stolen rabbit or a trap-caught bird could mean a rare meat stew shared by the whole family. Sometimes, the only meat they got came from scavenging or illegal trade. Now, for the nobility, meat was served in abundance, at least on the surface. Feasts were extravagant displays of wealth, featuring roasts, pies, and entire animals brought to the table. Peacocks and swans were cooked and then redressed in their feathers for decoration. Elaborate dishes were created more to impress than to satisfy hunger. But even among the elite, quality control was a gamble. Meat spoiled quickly, especially in warm months. Without refrigeration, it had to be eaten fast or preserved with salt and smoke. And this is where spices came in. Nobles imported exotic spices like cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, and pepper at great cost. These were not just for flavor. They were often used to disguise the taste and smell of meat that had started to turn. The more spices you used, the wealthier you appeared. A heavily spiced roast wasn't just a taste preference, it was a flex. But eating meat was risky. Foodborne illness was common, and no one understood bacteria. Rotten meat might be stewed with vinegar or wine in an attempt to fix it. Sausages could be riddled with parasites. Cuts might be undercooked or contaminated during butchering. If you got sick from food, you'd pray it passed. If it didn't, there were no antibiotics, only herbs, bleeding, and the hope your humors would balance themselves again. Preservation techniques were crude but essential. Salt curing was the most common. Meat would be packed in barrels with layers of salt, which pulled moisture out and delayed spoilage. Smoking was also popular, especially for fish and pork. It gave the meat a longer shelf life and a distinctly strong, earthy flavor. Sometimes the meat was so salty or tough, it had to be soaked for hours just to make it chewable. But for all its complications, meat was deeply tied to power, masculinity, and celebration. It was the centerpiece of religious feasts, royal banquets, and seasonal rituals. When people ate meat, they were reminded of their place in the world, whether it was at the top, carving a roast peacock, or at the bottom, gnawing on a salted pig's foot and hoping it wouldn't make them sick. In medieval times, spices were more than just a way to flavor food. They were wealth in powdered form. The mere presence of spices in a dish could indicate social rank, trade connections, and even moral virtue. They were as much about status as they were about taste. For the nobility, spices were a symbol of refinement and power. For everyone else, they were a distant dream, something heard about, maybe smelled in the rare market stall, but rarely tasted. The most prized spices came from far-off lands: black pepper from India, cinnamon and cassia from Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, cloves from the Moluccas, nutmeg and mace from the Banda Islands. These were not local herbs growing in your backyard. They were carried across continents and oceans along dangerous trade routes that stretched from the east to the Mediterranean, often passing through the hands of countless middlemen before reaching the kitchens of European elites. By the time they arrived, they were worth more than their weight in gold. Literally. In some cases, spices were so expensive they were locked in chests and counted seed by seed. But what many people forget is that these spices were often used not just to flavor food, but to mask the flavor of food that had already gone bad. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly. Even dried or salted meat could develop an unpleasant odor or taste, so spices were used to overpower that, heavy doses of pepper, ginger, and saffron, not to elevate flavor in a gourmet sense, but to hide decay and make something edible enough to swallow. A well-spiced stew might have had less to do with the cook's talent and more to do with the condition of the meat going in. And this wasn't limited to meat. Fish, often salted into oblivion or dried until brittle, could be revived, in a manner of speaking, with vinegar, mustard, or spice blends. Even bread or porridge could be spiced, especially for festivals or feast days. It added not just taste, but meaning. Certain spices were associated with warmth, health, or spiritual purity. For those who could afford them, spice blends were carefully composed and sometimes kept secret. Cooks in noble households guarded recipes and learned from their masters how to use spices with flair. There was even a theory that certain spices could balance the four humors, the guiding medical belief of the time. Hot, dry spices like pepper were thought to warm the body and aid digestion. Cool spices might calm an overheated temperament. Food was not just nourishment, it was medicine. Or at least, that was the belief. For the average person, though, spices were nearly impossible to come by. They might occasionally encounter local herbs, parsley, dill, mustard seeds, and mint. But pepper or cinnamon, that was the stuff of fairy tales. Most peasants relied on onions, garlic, leeks, and wild greens to give food any kind of flavor. Fermentation and souring were common. Think of pickled vegetables or vinegar-based sauces, because they were affordable ways to add punch to otherwise bland meals. But the dream of a heavily spiced stew, that was for the Lord's table, not the peasant's pot. Sometimes spices were used in wine or ale as well, heated and blended into mulled drinks that masked poor quality or extended shelf life. This wasn't just indulgence, it was practicality. And occasionally, a merchant or soldier might bring home a pouch of spice as a gift or trophy, to be used sparingly on holidays, weddings, or religious celebrations. It would be stored carefully, used sparingly, and cherished like a family heirloom. So while we might reach for salt and pepper today without a second thought, in the medieval world, these simple ingredients carried the weight of empire, exploration, and elite privilege. They turned foul into tolerable. They turned meals into ceremonies. And they drew a sharp line between those who ruled and those who merely endured. In the medieval world, drinking water was a gamble, and more often than not, a losing one. Streams, wells, and rivers were common sources of water, but so were waste dumps, animal pens, and open sewers. There was no knowledge of bacteria, no concept of waterborne disease, and certainly no water purification. So, when someone dipped a bucket into a murky stream to fetch water for the day, they were also collecting whatever had flowed into that stream upstream. Animal waste, human waste, rotting refuse, and whatever else the village had discarded. The result? Water that looked deceptively clean, but could, and often did, lead to dysentery, cholera, and death. Because of this, people turned to the one beverage that seemed safer: beer. Not the strong, hoppy beer we know today. Medieval beer, especially the kind drunk by peasants, was low in alcohol, often closer to what we'd call small beer or table beer. It was brewed quickly, sometimes within a day or two, and contained just enough alcohol to kill off harmful microbes. Children drank it. Monks drank it. Labourers drank it throughout the workday. It was part of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. In many ways, beer was considered a food, a liquid loaf of bread, providing calories and hydration in one. The brewing process was fairly straightforward, though time-consuming. Grains like barley or oats were mashed and boiled, sometimes flavoured with herbs or bittering agents, before hops became standard. The resulting liquid was cooled, fermented with wild or reused yeast, and stored in barrels. It didn't last long, so it was consumed quickly and brewed often. In fact, many households, especially in rural areas, brewed their own small beer regularly. Brewing was a domestic task, and women often served as the household brewers. The alewife was a common and important figure in the medieval community, managing both the fermentation and the sales of beer when it became a source of income. For the wealthy, wine was the preferred alternative. Imported from France, Italy, or Spain, wine was both expensive and symbolic of class and refinement. Even then, wine wasn't always high quality. It could spoil quickly, become vinegary, or grow thick with sediment. Spices or honey were often added to make it more palatable, creating variations like mulled wine or spiced wine known as hippocras. Watered wine was also common, especially in monasteries and among the educated classes, as a way of diluting its potency while still avoiding contaminated water. Monasteries played a major role in producing both beer and wine. Monks had the time, resources, and relative cleanliness to produce better quality drinks, and their products were often consumed not just by the religious community, but by pilgrims, travelers, and the local population. Brewing and winemaking became a skill, a tradition, and a source of income for many religious houses. Milk, contrary to popular assumption, was not a reliable everyday beverage. It spoiled quickly, especially without cooling, and was often used instead to make cheese or butter. Milk was associated more with children and the sick than with general consumption. The idea of pouring a cold glass of milk to enjoy with your meal, that belonged to a very different world. Juices were rare, and fruit was seasonal. Herbal infusions, broths, and fermented mixtures like mead or cider might be consumed occasionally, depending on region and availability. But beer remained the daily drink of choice. It was safe, familiar, and essential. It wasn't a party drink. It was survival in a mug. And despite its ubiquity, beer was still susceptible to spoilage. A bad batch could make you ill, though less often than contaminated water would. Still, given the choice between water that might kill you and beer that might leave you slightly fuzzy but alive, the decision was easy, even for a child. So, in a world where clean water was rare and sanitation was non-existent, beer became the backbone of hydration. It flowed through every meal, every household, and every social class, quietly keeping the medieval world alive while water itself remained a silent threat. In a medieval dining hall, the concept of table manners looked very different from what we know today. Forget the polished etiquette of multiple forks and silent chewing. Most meals were noisy, messy, and communal. Eating wasn't just a private affair. It was a performance of status, power, and practicality. And at the center of it all was the human hand. Forks were virtually unknown in early medieval Europe. Though they existed in some parts of the Byzantine Empire and Islamic world, forks were slow to catch on in the West. In fact, when they were first introduced, they were often viewed with suspicion. Some even considered them sinful or effeminate. Why use a tool to eat what God clearly gave you fingers for? So people used knives and spoons when necessary, but mostly they used their hands. Grabbing, tearing, dipping. It was a tactile, intimate experience. Washing hands before meals was expected in noble households, but not always enforced and rarely observed among the poor. After all, water itself wasn't clean and soap was a luxury. Plates, as we think of them, were uncommon for much of the Middle Ages. Instead, diners often used trenchers, thick slices of stale bread that served as edible plates. These trenchers soaked up juices, sauces, and grease during the meal, and were either eaten afterward, thrown to the dogs, or given to the poor. In wealthier homes, wooden boards or metal platters might be used, often shared between two people. Eating from a communal dish was normal. Personal space was not a priority. And then there were the cups. A shared drinking vessel was passed around the table, especially among the lower classes. Everyone sipped from the same mug of ale or wine, regardless of cleanliness, illness, or etiquette. To drink without spilling was a skill. To drink and not get sick from someone else's germs was a matter of luck, or maybe just a stronger immune system. In grand halls, the atmosphere was equal parts feast and chaos. Lords and their guests sat at the high table, elevated and visible, while the rest sat lower down, in long rows. Servants moved between them, carrying trenchers, pitchers and food, but there were no menus. Dishes were brought out in courses, often set on the table all at once. Nobles might receive roasted meat, pies, and spiced wine. The lower tables might get pottage and bread. The hierarchy of food reflected the hierarchy of people, clearly and unapologetically. Noise was constant. People talked, laughed, sang, belched, and occasionally argued. Food was chewed loudly. Bones were thrown onto the floor. Dogs waited nearby for scraps, and no one batted an eye. The idea of sitting quietly with good posture, chewing with your mouth closed, and waiting your turn to speak, that came centuries later. In the Middle Ages, dinner was a social affair, a place to network, negotiate, and assert dominance. Cleanliness and restraint were secondary concerns. Still, there were rules, especially among the nobility. Books of etiquette existed and were taught to children of high rank. These included instructions like, do not put half-chewed food back on the plate, do not pick your teeth with your knife, and do not blow your nose in the tablecloth. These rules were needed because such behaviors were common. Manners had to be taught, and not everyone was eager to learn them. Monasteries with their structured routines had stricter rules. Meals were often eaten in silence, accompanied by readings of scripture. Monks used simple utensils and were expected to eat modestly without waste. Their habits influenced the broader culture over time, helping to shape ideas of discipline and restraint at the table. But for the average villager, or even the average knight, meals remained far messier and more boisterous. In towns and cities, public eating houses or taverns began to appear where meals could be bought and shared. Again, food was served in communal dishes, and you might find yourself sitting next to a stranger. There was little privacy and few expectations for manners beyond basic courtesy and not starting a fight. The idea of dining as a quiet, personal experience was foreign. In fact, the louder and more crowded the setting, the more alive it felt. So, while modern diners may fret over forks or fret about elbows on the table, the medieval world was far more relaxed and far more chaotic. Table manners existed, but they were flexible, improvised, and rooted in survival, not sophistication. Eating was messy, loud, and shared, and for many, that made it all the more human. Among the many strange culinary traditions of the medieval world, few were as oddly enduring and vaguely unsettling as the perpetual stew. Imagine a large iron pot hanging over a smoky hearth, simmering day and night, never truly emptied, always absorbing new ingredients. This was not a one-time meal. It was a living, bubbling cauldron of sustenance, a sort of medieval slow cooker that never turned off. And for many families, especially those in rural or impoverished areas, it was the heart of their diet. The perpetual stew, also called forever soup in some historical references, was both a convenience and a necessity. Life was hard, time was scarce, and food was unpredictable. So instead of preparing a fresh dish every night, people simply added new food to the same pot. Today, it might be onions and barley. Tomorrow, a few carrots and beans. If someone caught a rabbit, in it went. If bread went stale, it could be soaked in the broth. Leftovers? Toss them in. Old meat? Dice it and hope the spices do their job. This method was incredibly practical. It made the most of limited resources and ensured that nothing went to waste. It also created a sense of continuity in the household, a pot that never stopped cooking, never stopped nourishing. The stew became more than food. It was a presence in the home, something that changed and evolved with each passing day. The flavors deepened, blended, and darkened, sometimes to the point of mystery. You might take a bite and wonder, what did this used to be? In wealthier households, stews were more structured, made fresh with better ingredients. But even there, the principle of reusing and repurposing was present. Bones from yesterday's roast could become today's broth. Peels, rinds, and trimmings might be simmered into stock. Nothing was wasted because everything cost something: time, money, labor, or life. The peasant version, though, was far less refined. The pot itself might not be cleaned for days or even weeks. Why scrub it when you're just going to refill it? As long as it kept boiling, the heat was assumed to keep it safe. Whether or not this was true depended on a dozen factors: the ingredients, the temperature, the length of time it sat overnight. But there were no thermometers or health inspectors. People trusted fire, salt, and hope. Stew pots were often handed down from generation to generation. A large cast iron pot was one of the most valuable items a family could own. It was durable, versatile, and, in a strange way, sacred. Stories were told around it. Meals were shared from it. When there was nothing else, there was always the pot. Pottage, a thicker variation of the stew made with grains like oats, barley, or rye, was especially common. It was affordable, filling, and could be endlessly adjusted. Onions, leeks, cabbage, and turnips were common additions. Protein came in the form of beans, lentils, or the occasional bit of meat or fat. Spices were rare, so flavor came from the long cooking process, which softened everything and blended the ingredients into one thick, soupy mass. It wasn't fancy, and it certainly wasn't pretty, but it did the job. Some folklore even speaks of stews that simmered for years, decades, in rare claims, though this is more legend than fact. Still, the idea captured people's imagination: a stew that never ends, a meal that carries the memory of every meal before it. There's something poetic about that, even if the reality was closer to a murky, bubbling swamp of leftovers and guesswork. Today, we rotate recipes weekly. We toss expired food. We clean our pans. But in the medieval home, the perpetual stew was a symbol of endurance, of making do, of holding a family together with heat, water, and whatever the land, or luck, could provide. Medieval life was a constant balancing act between feast and famine. For most people, the availability of food wasn't predictable. It depended on the weather, the harvest, the livestock, the whims of local lords, and, quite often, sheer luck. One year, you might have a decent crop and a barn full of grain. The next, a flood or drought could wipe everything out, leaving entire villages hungry. And when hunger came, it didn't just mean smaller portions. It meant real starvation, swollen bellies, sunken eyes, and a gnawing emptiness that lingered day and night. For peasants, meals were built around consistency, not variety. Bread, pottage, and ale formed the core of the daily diet. These staples didn't change much because they couldn't change much. A peasant family didn't have access to exotic ingredients, nor did they expect surprise dishes to show up at the dinner table. What they had, they stretched. What they lacked, they endured. But even in this struggle, there were rare moments of abundance: festivals, religious holidays, weddings, or the end of a harvest. These moments offered a temporary escape from monotony, when food might actually overflow. A pig might be slaughtered. Baked goods might appear. Fruits, if in season, could be shared freely. There was dancing, drinking, singing. And for one brief day, hunger didn't rule. Feasts in noble households were a different spectacle altogether. They were not just about feeding people. They were about showing off. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted animals, fruit pies, layered pastries, and molded jellies. Some dishes were designed to impress more than nourish. You might see a roast swan, redressed in its feathers, its neck twisted elegantly, or a pie that, when opened, released live birds into the air, a trick designed to dazzle the guests. Feasts could last for hours, even days, especially during royal events or holy celebrations. But behind the glitz was a massive operation. Dozens of cooks, spit-turners, bakers, and servers, all working in smoke-filled kitchens to make sure the spectacle didn't falter. The food itself wasn't always delicious by modern standards. Much of it was overcooked, overspiced, or preserved. But it was abundant, and abundance was everything. Yet, these moments of plenty were always followed by a return to reality. Even for nobles, supply lines were fragile. A bad harvest could mean higher prices, food shortages, or rationing. For the poor, it could mean death. Famines swept through Europe multiple times during the Middle Ages, triggered by crop failure, war, or disease. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for instance, led to mass starvation. Grain stores emptied. People ate bark, grass, and worse. Markets collapsed. Parents abandoned children. It wasn't just hunger. It was despair. What's more, the seasons dictated everything. In the spring, food was at its scarcest. Winter stores were nearly gone, and the new crops hadn't yet matured. This brutal stretch of time was known as the Hungry Gap. Even those who had prepared carefully might find their cupboards bare. And unlike today, there was no supermarket down the road, no aid shipment, no emergency stockpile. People simply waited and hoped and prayed. Preservation techniques helped, but they were limited. Salting, smoking, drying, and pickling could extend the life of food, but only so far. The salt had to be harvested or bought. The smoking required constant attention. The drying depended on good weather. Everything came at a cost, whether in time, labor, or money. Nothing was easy. Everything was uncertain. Yet despite the hardships, food in medieval times wasn't just about survival. It was also about identity. What you ate told others who you were. A simple bowl of pottage marked you as a peasant. A roast capon covered in saffron sauce announced you as a lord. Even hunger had a social meaning. The poor were expected to endure it with humility, while the wealthy were expected to relieve it, at least in theory. In truth, the medieval table, whether sparse or sumptuous, reflected the larger realities of life in that era: unpredictable, hierarchical, bound to nature, and constantly in flux. You never quite knew what tomorrow's meal would look like, or if it would come at all. As we leave behind the flickering firelight of the medieval kitchen, the smoky air, the bubbling stews, the coarse bread and uncertain meats, you begin to notice the silence. No more clanging pots, no more growling stomachs, just the soft, steady rhythm of time passing, as it always did. In a world without electricity, without comfort, without certainty, people found a way to eat, to share, to survive. Meals weren't about luxury or flavor, but about endurance, about scraping together whatever the earth and the season would allow. There was no menu, no recipes, just instinct, memory, and hope. So as you lie here now, warm and full, in a world of abundance those before us couldn't imagine, you can let go. Let go of the noise, the hunger, the worry. Drift into the deep quiet of another time, a time when food was simple, life was hard. But even then, people found moments of comfort, of laughter, of togetherness, gathered around something warm. And now, you can rest, knowing that their story is part of yours, that even the humblest meals carry with them the memory of all who came before. Sleep well.